Hello, I'm Alejandro. I have a story to share about something strange and eerie. This happened at the hospital where I work. If you're familiar with the story about the teacher and her loyal dog at school, where the dog would wait for her, not knowing she had already passed away, my story has some similarities to that. However, this one isn't as heartwarming as the story of the teacher and her dog. I work as an orderly, someone who cleans patients' rooms. I've been employed at this private hospital for more than 20 years. I've even worked under the first director before he was replaced due to old age and illness. The hospital is located near a school and a public market, so there are many small houses around the area. Stray dogs and cats often wander near the hospital grounds, especially around the generator area. It wasn't an issue since the animals didn't really cause any trouble, and they were taken care of by the nearby residents. However, when Dr. Garcia took over as the hospital director, by the way, I've purposely changed his name, things started to change. Let me get back to the story. He banned any stray dogs or cats from wandering around, saying they were a nuisance in the parking area and would mess everywhere. He even ordered the guards to poison these animals. But the guards instead just warned the residents to keep their pets confined because Dr. Garcia was upset. The pet owners were shocked at how extreme his measures were. It wasn't like that under the previous director. Whenever Dr. Garcia saw a stray dog or cat, he would shoo them away, kick them, or throw stones at them. He was so cruel to animals that even we were a bit wary of him, especially when he arrived at the hospital and spotted animals in the parking lot. He would be furious, yelling at the guards. One time, according to Rodrigo, one of the guards, Dr. Garcia had a heated argument with a resident because he kicked a stray dog in the parking lot. It turned out that the dog's owner was nearby, buying medicine at the hospital pharmacy. The dog's owner was furious because his pet wasn't supposed to be roaming freely, and the only reason it was outside was that it was accompanying him. Dr. Garcia kicked the dog and it cried out. When the owner heard this, he confronted Dr. Garcia. The two had a confrontation, and Rodrigo had to intervene. That's what he said he remembered before the dogs and cats started behaving differently toward Dr. Garcia. They would growl at him whenever he tried to shoo or throw stones at them. Before, they would just run away. Then, as soon as he arrived, the dogs would bark loudly. The number of dogs in the parking lot also increased. They would bark at him but leave once he was gone, almost like they were keeping watch. Until one day, Rodrigo rushed someone to the ER. I thought it was just another patient, but it turned out to be Dr. Garcia. His car had been parked for a long time, and he hadn't come out, so they knocked on his window. His mouth was foaming. The cats were climbing on top of his car, and the dogs were peeking through the windows. Dr. Garcia died. The cause was carbon monoxide poisoning. After his death, the dogs continued to hang out in the parking lot, roaming freely because their enemy was no longer around. But what's chilling is that there are times when they would look at the parking slot where Dr. Garcia used to park and start barking, just like when he was alive and shooing them away. My name is Jericho. I'd like to share a story about something I witnessed back when I used to work as a member of the EPA. I am part of the demolition team. We all know what the demolition team members do. We are the ones who clear street vendors from sidewalks, and sometimes even houses and waterways in private lands. When we are not clearing structures, we paint walls and flyovers, usually those vandalized by protesters or unruly youth. The story I will share happened during Chairman Verano's time. Back then, we were actively removing vendors from the sides of the roads. We gave warnings to stall owners before dismantling their shops. But there were some who were really persistent. Some would leave when we told them to, but as soon as we were gone, they would come back to sell again. One time, we were tasked to remove vendors selling in front of a church. When the huckster boys saw us coming, they would immediately scatter. They would loudly bang their boxes, a signal that we were arriving. When the others heard this sound and saw the boys running, all the vendors would quickly flee. They even called us Lannisters because they thought we were villains like in Game of Thrones. The ambulant vendors could leave quickly since they could just push their carts, but those with fixed stalls panicked and struggled to pack up. Some ran away, leaving their goods behind. When we got off the truck, we gathered the abandoned goods. We ignored the vendors' pleas because we were just following orders. But there was one vendor who fought back and got angry. We were shocked when one of our teammates, Dennis, suddenly shouted. He had been stabbed in the stomach, His intestines were spilling out. One of our colleagues quickly took off his uniform, used it to hold Dennis' intestines, like a belt bag. The intestines were huge, and they smelled bad. Everything became chaotic. I was one of the people who rushed Dennis to the hospital. When we got there, he was immediately taken to the emergency room, but he didn't make it. Aside from his intestines spilling out, he had lost too much blood. I stayed at the hospital, while the others went back to report the incident to our office and to file a case against the attacker. While waiting for Dennis' body to be released, they covered him with a sheet. I could still see his hand, pale, but with blood at the tips of his nails. Suddenly, his hand moved. I blinked in disbelief. I thought it was a miracle because his hands seemed to open and rest on the mattress. Then, his body rose. I was about to call for a doctor, but I noticed something strange. He looked like smoke. He was human-shaped, but he was made of smoke. I couldn't see Dennis' face. He was so blurry and hazy. He just sat there on the mattress, his head bowed. I felt like crying, a mix of fear and pity. I knew Dennis was a breadwinner, and he was still young. Then he turned to look at me, but his face was still unclear. He got off the bed and started walking. That was when I became truly afraid, thinking he might possess me. But instead, he just walked out of the room. I was frozen for a few moments before I decided to check Dennis' body again. When I lifted the sheet, his body was still there. His face looked sad, and there was a tear at the corner of his eye. I really felt sorry for him. That was the first time I had ever seen a ghost. Right in front of me, I saw Dennis' soul leave his body. I'm Jamil, and I'd like to share an experience I had when my father was confined at hospital. My two siblings, my mom and I, took turns watching over him because we all had work commitments we couldn't just abandon. Only one person could stay with him at a time, while the rest could only visit during visiting hours. I was the one left to watch over him at night since I worked mornings, and my workplace was near the hospital. I'd bring a change of clothes and shower at work since it was more convenient. To be honest, I didn't believe in ghosts or monsters like Baba Yaga until I experienced something firsthand at the hospital. It was my first night watching over my dad. I was already annoyed because I forgot to ask my mom and siblings where the restroom was. I couldn't use the one in the room since it was under maintenance and wouldn't be fixed until the next day, so I had to go downstairs to ask where to find one. There were only two ways down: the stairs or the elevator. Of course, I chose the elevator. It was faster. Whenever I take the stairs in old buildings, whether it's a school or a hospital, I always feel like someone's following me, even if I can't see anyone. And I don't know why, but I always imagine someone waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs. So I walked through the dimly lit hallway toward the elevator, trying to act brave despite the darkness. I couldn't remember if it was already early morning or not. When I reached the elevator, I pressed the button to go to the ground floor. I waited for the doors to close, holding in my need to pee. The elevator was so slow, and I still had to ask for directions to the restroom. Then, just one floor down, the elevator suddenly stopped. I half expected the lights to flicker, because that's what usually happens in old elevators. But they didn't. Instead, the light became very dim, almost too faint to see anything. When the doors opened, I heard the sound of wheels rolling in. My hair stood on end because I was still the only person in the elevator. But I could feel it. Something had entered. The sound was so close, like someone was pulling a wheelchair right beside me. After another floor, the elevator lights went out completely. It felt like forever before they turned back on. I immediately grabbed my phone to use the flashlight. When I turned on the flashlight, it shone directly on the corner beside me. That's when I saw my companion in the elevator. It was a large woman with long hair covering her face, sitting in a rusty wheelchair. Her legs were covered in festering wounds. As soon as I saw her, I stumbled backward, hitting the wall of the elevator. I quickly turned off my flashlight. When we reached the ground floor and the doors opened, the woman in the wheelchair was gone. But I heard the wheels again, being dragged out of the elevator. I forgot all about needing to pee. My dad stayed in the hospital for 3 days due to intestinal issues. Thankfully, there were no emergencies that required me to use the elevator again. When I told my sibling about the experience, they just laughed. Apparently, there was a restroom on the same floor as our room. During my trainee days at a major public hospital, I experienced something that has haunted me ever since. It was my final duty to complete the required hours for my internship, and my classmates and I were eager to finish. We never expected the night to take such a dark turn. Around 8 p.m., a heavily pregnant young woman was rushed into the delivery room. She was sobbing uncontrollably, and her chart revealed she was only 17 years old. Despite her youthful face, her body seemed oddly developed, as though she were much older. Let's call her Delia. This was her first child, conceived with her boyfriend, and the baby's size was making the delivery agonizingly difficult. Delia was on the verge of delivery, but something was off. She wasn't pushing properly, almost as if she was resisting the process. Dr. Tadifa, the OB on duty, sternly coached her, but her efforts were half-hearted. The tension in the room thickened as the doctor mentioned the possibility of a C-section, warning that the baby was retreating upward. Delia's mother, visibly distraught, begged against the operation, citing its cost. Finally, after much urging, Delia managed a single, desperate push. What happened next left everyone stunned. The baby slid out, but it wasn't like any newborn we had ever seen. Its skin was a sickly shade of green, glistening as though wet with something thicker than amniotic fluid. Coils of thick white curly hair covered its head, eyebrows, and eyelashes, giving it an eerie, otherworldly appearance. Its features were striking yet unsettling. Sharp nose, deep red lips, and elongated limbs that hinted at a strange, unnatural growth. The room was silent, save for the shallow, panicked breathing of those present. The baby didn't cry, didn't move. Even when Dr. Tadifa spanked it, there was no sign of life. Instead, a faint, pungent odor filled the room, something acrid and metallic that made my stomach churn. Delia's mother broke down in wails, while Delia stared blankly at the ceiling, her face pale and drenched in sweat. Dr. Tadifa's face betrayed no emotion, as if she had seen this before, or worse, expected it. She calmly assured Delia's mother that everything would remain confidential, especially given the sensitivity of the case. Her words were rehearsed, mechanical, as if she'd delivered them many times before. I felt cold all over. Later, as the chaos subsided, Delia's mother confided in us. She spoke in whispers, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Delia's boyfriend, she claimed, wasn't human. He was a werewolf, a supernatural being she met during a school tour. He worked as a guard, or so they thought. He would visit Delia's home, charming everyone with his polite demeanor and striking appearance. But when Delia became pregnant, he vanished without a trace. The family had searched for him, even consulting a witch doctor. That was when the truth came out. The witch doctor revealed that the man wasn't a man at all, but a werewolf, who had seduced Delia with the sole purpose of fathering a child. Delia's hesitation during labor now made sense. She must have feared what her baby might be. I still can't erase the image of that baby from my mind. It wasn't just unusual. It was unnatural. Its elongated limbs seemed to twitch faintly, even though it was declared stillborn. For a split second, I thought I saw its eyes flutter open, revealing unnervingly bright, almost glowing, white irises. The doctor dismissed it as a post-mortem spasm, but I'm not so sure. Even now, years later, I can't help but feel that something was terribly wrong that night. The hospital felt colder, darker, as if the shadows themselves were alive. And sometimes in my dreams, I see that baby, not dead, but crawling, growing, watching. Around the year 1990, my father was hospitalized due to severe complications from diabetes. His left foot had developed a massive wound surrounded by festering sores and thick, oozing pus. The doctors discussed the possibility of amputation to prevent the infection from spreading. My father cried out in pain, his suffering almost unbearable. Since our mother had passed away years before, it was just my sister Anna and me taking care of him. Anna, though, was different. She had always seen things that others couldn't. Strange entities, spirits, things that didn't belong in this world. A relative once took her to a witch doctor who told us her third eye was open and that she could see the unseen. I never took it seriously at first, but after what happened with my father, I couldn't help but wonder. One evening, I texted Anna in a panic. My father kept complaining about relentless headaches, even though his diabetes was the obvious issue. The headache seemed out of place, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When Anna arrived at the hospital room, her eyes immediately darted to my father's bed, and her face went pale. Without saying a word, she walked over and sat next to him. After a few moments, she turned to me and whispered in a low voice, "There's something here. A shadow. A child." I didn't believe her at first, but she was insistent. She described how a small, dark figure seemed to be playing around my father's bed, biting his head, just out of his sight. "It's not a regular child," she said. "It's something darker." Her voice trembled, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. I tried to laugh it off, but her words lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After we finally left the hospital, Anna spoke more about her encounters, but she only told me because, as she explained, the entities she saw didn't like being talked about. She said that speaking their names or acknowledging them could draw their attention, and once they had your attention, they wouldn't stop. That night, back at home, things got worse. After we put our father to bed, I kept hearing soft footsteps, like someone running through the hallways. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me from the stress, but then I saw it. A small, dark shadow darting past the corner of my eye, running up the stairs, disappearing into the dark corners of the house. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't mention it to Anna, but every night after that, the shadow returned. I would see it from the corner of my eye, hear it whispering, laughing quietly in the dark. Once, I woke up in the middle of the night to find my father's bedroom door ajar, a small, shadowy figure standing at the threshold. My father's eyes were wide open, but he was staring blankly at the wall, unblinking. The worst part? Every time I tried to look directly at the shadow, it vanished, always just out of my reach, slipping away into the darkness. Anna warned me that the more we acknowledged it, the worse it would get. But I couldn't stop myself from watching, from waiting. And every time I did, the shadow seemed to get closer, more persistent. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was always there, watching, waiting for the moment it would make itself known for good. I'm not sure what it was. A spirit? A demon? Something even worse? But whatever it was, it never left. It just lurked, unseen, in the darkest corners of our lives. And no matter how much I try to ignore it, I can still feel its presence, just behind me, always watching, waiting. It was a quiet day when I visited the hospital with my brother to see our grandfather. I arrived early, having the day off from school, while my brother was running late from work. To kill time, I found a bench in the dimly lit hallway and settled in, pulling out my phone to play a game. I was fully immersed in the game, the soft glow of my screen, the only light in the otherwise eerie corridor. Suddenly, I felt someone sit beside me. A man with a thick mustache and a protruding belly glanced at me, his gaze heavy and unsettling. Without warning, he spoke. "That looks like a fun game, boy." His voice was too familiar, his presence too intrusive. I pretended not to hear him, but he wasn't put off. I kept my eyes focused on my game, hoping he'd take the hint. After my match, I glanced up briefly. He was still sitting there, watching me, his smile far too wide. I smiled back politely, then quickly looked away, relieved that the conversation seemed to end there. Time dragged on. I looked at my phone. No texts, no calls. My brother was still nowhere to be seen. To distract myself, I started watching the people around me. The hospital was alive with movement. Patients, visitors, staff. Each person wrapped in their own quiet world. It seemed like an ordinary day. Then I noticed it a child, running down the hallway. The sharp clacking of their slippers echoed through the silence, a sound that grated on my nerves, especially in a place where people were supposed to rest. I muttered to myself, irritated by the noise. The man beside me, who had been silent for a while, suddenly spoke again. "Let it be," he said in a low, almost detached voice. I frowned. The noise might disturb others, I said, my tone more sharp than I intended. He leaned in, his breath cool against my ear. That's not a child, he said, his voice now almost a whisper, full of something unsettling. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to him, my voice barely a whisper. What do you mean? His eyes locked onto mine, cold and unblinking. It hasn't been in this world for a long time. Watch it closely next time it runs by. A chill spread through my body. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I turned my eyes back to the child, who was now running past again, its small form darting through the hallway with unnatural speed. This time, I forced myself to watch, and that's when I saw it. The child didn't run around people, it ran through them. Its tiny, ghostly figure passed straight through a nurse, whose back was turned, and through an elderly woman without any reaction from either of them. It wasn't even visible to them. It was as though it wasn't really there, my breath caught in my throat. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. But when I looked around, no one else seemed to notice. The hallway continued to buzz with people, as if nothing was wrong. I turned back to the man, wanting to ask more, but he was gone. The bench beside me was empty, vacant, as though he had never been there. My heart hammered in my chest, the reality of what I had seen sinking in. I didn't know if I should be relieved that he was gone, or terrified that I had been left alone to process what just happened. My brother eventually arrived, unaware of the horror I'd just witnessed. I didn't dare mention it, but even now, the memory haunts me. Was that man just some strange visitor? Or was he something else? Something not quite human? And that thing running in the hallway, what was it?